Friends, way back in the prehistoric olden days of the early 1990s, the SUV, well, it wasn't invented, but it became incredibly popular. So much so that in 1997, Mercedes-Benz introduced its own SUV. But somewhere between then and now, the warring tribe to Mercedes, well, they came up with their own interpretation of an SUV, but one with slightly less U. And for reasons completely beyond my understanding, it became very popular. So much so that Mercedes-Benz has come up with their own interpretation of this very strange blend of SUV, but they have blessed theirs with lots of style and even more horsepower. So let's head over to Deutschland to drive the Mercedes SUV that has lots of HP, but slightly less U. So before we get into the bullets numbers, we need to thank Herr Stefan Wiedmeier because he is the one that hand-built this engine in a Vaterach. I just like saying that. There's a silent R there, but it sounds very rough and coarse and exciting when we get into an engine that has 577 horsepower. Why does it have 577 horsepower? It is because it has two turbos strapped to a 5.5-liter V8. Now, I know what you're thinking. We've seen this engine before, but here it has 561 pound-feet of torque. And what's interesting about that is, number one, it comes in at a relatively low 1,750 RPM, and number two, it is a little bit lower than other applications of this engine. So I think we need to go out and find out how that translates to the roads of southern Bavaria. Have you ever had that feeling like you've been here before? Well, this is one of those instances, because we've driven this engine before, and it was in that, Santa Maria, Madre Dios, that S63 Coupe that we still dream about. But we've already discovered this is down a little bit on torque, but how does that translate to out here on the road? Well, let's just say there is never an instance where you feel flat-footed. Like, for example, let's go around this turn here and downshift to 2, come out with a little power, and the thing just pulls like a freight train. Even with the extra weight of this thing's like almost 5,200 pounds. Let me repeat that, 5,200 pounds, but almost 600 horsepower and 561 pound-feet of torque absolutely get you out of any instance where you feel maybe a little bit flat-footed. So that's totally no surprise, because when you have almost 600 horsepower and 561 pound-feet of torque, let's just say you're not going to be without power. If anything, you've got the same problem Spider-Man has. With great power comes great responsibility. But what Spider-Man doesn't have is an AMG exhaust. Now, I know this is going to sound weird, but let's slow down and downshift and just listen to this. I think we should do that again. It just snarls and burbles and gets angry at you. Your incredibly expensive AMG sport utility vehicle that doesn't have as much utility as the other sport utility vehicles yells at you when you tell it to go slower. And that is a wonderful thing. So this is a curious case of trading one utility for another. So, now don't get me wrong here, there is a significant amount of storage back here, but being honest, we are all slaves to design. That's why we have this fast C-pillar here, and really this utility vehicle doesn't have as much utility. That is why it is very creatively called a coupe. Now here's where I get confused. When this segment was invented many years ago, I was the first one to say, who would buy such a vehicle? It's a utility vehicle that doesn't have utility. But then the segment kind of exploded, and now I look at it kind of as an equation. If you think of the coupe up here as one part, and then the utility down here as another part, so that's 1 plus 1, and then you have all-wheel drive, so that's 4. The question is, when you add all of that together, suspension, the utility pieces down here, and the design, does that equal more than 6? Okay, so I already let the dirty little secret out of the bag that this thing weighs 5,200 pounds, and that is definitely going to have an effect on driving dynamics. But after all, this thing is an SUV, at least from here down. From here up, it's got this sort of coupe look thing about it. And really, if you look at the ass end, it looks just like that S65 coupe that we love so much. But really, there are two things going on here. There's this adjustable dynamic control system here, and there's an adjustable, they call it airmatic, but adjusts more than the air suspension. So let's focus over here. So we've been doing this whole thing so far in Sport Plus. And so really all of these 5 modes, it's really 4 plus an individual mode, they adjust things like transmission mapping, engine mapping, the dampers, even adjust the ride height. So like we're in Sport Plus mode, it lowers the ride height by about 1/4 of an inch. There's even a slippery mode. Now granted, we're in, what is it? It's like 70 degrees out in southern Germany, so we're not going to use the slippery mode. That's generally for foul weather. And really that kind of adjusts the transmission mapping so that transmission will start in a higher gear, the ride height goes up, so you can deal with inclement weather a bit better. Then there's the Sport, which is like, you know what, I feel aggressive today, but not too aggressive. And then there's the Comfort mode, and this is the one where the ride height goes to the highest mode, and it drives kind of like the ML. It's got a little bit more compliance in the suspension. But then there's this individual mode, and this is where you can adjust each of the pieces, so the transmission, the engine, and the suspension individually. So like if you want the transmission to be in sport mode, I can go in here and select the transmission, and I can literally go between manual and automatic drive. So if I put it in manual, now listen to that. One interesting note, when you set the transmission in manual mode, you can hear it, it's redlining, it won't shift. But it's telling you it's big red 2 up, and it's screaming at you to shift. So let's go ahead and upshift. Now the transmission is another instance like we've been here before. We've driven this transmission in the S63. And this is an interesting thing, because we'll drive the GLE 450 when we get back to California. We just didn't have enough time to get to that one. That has a new 9-speed transmission. And really what they're doing there is the 9 speeds is all about fuel economy. But an interesting thing about that 9-speed, it's going away from what Mercedes has done in other new cars, even all the way down to the CLA, where it's a torque converter, like that S65 we drove, instead of a dual clutch. But this transmission, this is the 7-speed, and it's virtually the same as you get out of that S63. But what's interesting here, this is the first time that it's paired with this engine and this setup of 4MATIC. So the idea is you have a sportier tune on the transmission that actually has some dynamic all-wheel drive functionality. Willkommen bei Füssen Bayern. We're driving along the Romantische Straße, otherwise known as the Romantic Road. And one of the most iconic stops along that road is the castle behind me. Now, if you're a guy, a girl, car guy, non-car guy, you know that castle back there because Disney has popularized it as Cinderella's castle. And you think, well, the Germans, they kind of ripped off Cinderella's castle. Actually, it's the other way around. And it's got a very interesting backstory. You see, the last king of Bavaria, König Ludwig, he grew up just over those trees over there in a castle called Schloss Hohenschwangau, otherwise known locally here as the Yellow Castle. And as he was growing up, he dreamed of building these palatial estates and filling them with art throughout his tenure as king. Well, he grew up, he was crowned the king, and he did just that. He bought lots of art, built many different castles around the then state of Bavaria. But the problem was he almost bankrupted the entire state of Bavaria, which was effectively its own land. His crowning achievement was that castle behind me, which is Schloss Neuschwanstein. And it was envisioned to be the most luxurious and really the most palatial of palatial estates. But there's 2 interesting fun facts about it. Number one, you look at it and you see how ornate it is. But the reality is, you look inside, only a handful of the rooms are actually finished. And the most interesting fun fact, you look at it and think, what, it's like 400 or 500 years old? In actuality, that Schloss was finished only a couple of years before Mercedes and Benz started building cars. So now let's go back to Sport Plus mode and focus on AMG ride control. What is that, you ask? So we already got a bunch of suspension settings and engine and throttle mapping and all that stuff here. So what do we need this for? This focuses solely on the air suspension and the steering. So I can go between Sport and Sport Plus, and this is completely separate from this dynamic mode here. So the idea is, remember the S65 Coupe that has that curve control thing that we love so much? This is not so much curve control. This adjusts a number of different settings like the dampers, but there's also an active roll bar in the front and the rear, and it stiffens when going around corners. So the idea here is if I want to go into Sport Plus, let's say let's downshift. Oh, I like downshifting in this thing. Let's downshift, accelerate, go up to this curve here. And in Sport Plus, in both AMG Ride and over here in the dynamic setting, basically this thing defies the laws of physics between these two pieces. So the obvious question is, if you have this, what the hell do you need this for? And I think really in practice, this is great and takes the handling and driving dynamics to about 6/10. But by having the AMG ride control, yes, you stiffen up the steering, but really by having the active roll bars, it doesn't do the full lean in the turn like the S65, but it gives you more composure over roll, squat, pitch, and dive. And that's really saying something when you consider 5,200 pounds and it's an SUV. So now, yes, this is an incredibly familiar place to be if you know a Mercedes-Benz, but we've talked about in other episodes that Steve Jobs and the folks at Google are pretty much taking over the interior of your car, not just from a CarPlay or Android Auto perspective. It's more of there's an iPad or some sort of tablet sitting on the top of your dash, and this is no exception. But there are two exceptions to this application. Number one, does your iPad have gauges that rev when you have an almost 600 horsepower engine? And number two, do you have a graphical display of what's going on with your almost 600 horsepower engine when it revs that's showing all of the suspension modifications, the G-forces, as well as the squat and dive of your Coupe AMG? So I know I've geeked out about AMG interiors before, but this is a little bit of a different place to be, and that's really for a couple of reasons. Yeah, it's got all of the leather covering and the stitching, and really, this color ain't great. Like, if I were buying this car, I saw the GLE 450 before we left, and it was a red with a very light gray interior, and it had the black on the doors and the dash. Very stunning color combination. This is just blue with a black. We talked about contrast before, but it really hides the fact that you've got this thick steering wheel, you got the stitching, and even the suede on the headliner. Granted, this thing is missing a sunroof. I don't know why they didn't give us a sunroof here. But notice, you've got the aluminum trim that kind of jets out from the door. It's a nice like 3D touch, like a design detail that really stands out in this over other Mercedes SUVs. Here is kind of the biggest thing. You got this screen here. We talked about this in other cars. It doesn't hide or go away, and at the price level that this thing is, I would really want to see that hide. Because if you look at the S-Class, they hide the screen underneath the binnacle, so it doesn't like, it's not in your face. Where here, they've done all this beautiful work on the dash, and the design work is pretty cool. I would love to be able to have this go away and just look at like almost it's like borderline Swedish furniture design, not so much German Bauhaus. And then last but not least, I know we've geeked out about the Burmester stereos and how much we love the speaker grills on those things. This is the first time I think I've seen a Bang & Olufsen stereo in a Mercedes. Granted, it's very cool. You got the tweeters up here with the light, but I don't know. I still like the speaker grills on the Burmester. So in summary, what do we got? Well, we have a go-fast utility vehicle that is a slave to design, that debuts new AMG technology we have not seen in other AMGs. And as we've already discussed, this is a segment that I didn't see coming. So really, it presents us with a unique question. Because really, we have the same engine that we know and love. 5.5 liters, twin turbocharged, 577 horsepower. But really, it's the carrying case we have to really focus on. And the reason why is We've got a totally new design, but driving dynamics and chassis control that is beyond capable. It's unexpected. So I'm going to leave you with a very specific question. And this one would be hard for me to answer. Would you take that 577 horsepower twin turbo engine in this fancy carrying case, or, wait for it, an E63 wagon? Let me know in the comments below or via our social media, Motoman TV, all one word, Motoman TV, all one word, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And from now, Österreich, I bid you auf Wiedersehen.